You know, usually when we set out to understand a foreign government, there is this underlying expectation of precision.
Right, like we expect to see the blueprints for an engine.
Exactly. You pull up an organizational chart and you see the neatly drawn boxes, the solid lines connecting them, and you can point your finger and say, well, that person drafts the legislation, that person enforces it, and that person interprets it.
It is comforting because it is visible. I mean, the mechanics of power are just right out in the open.
It really gives us a false sense of security.
Oh, absolutely. We map our own expectations of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch onto systems that operate in, an entirely different universe of political physics.
Well, welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today, our mission is to completely dismantle those expectations for you. We are unpacking the intricate, fascinating, and honestly often deliberately obscured machinery of Chinese domestic politics.
Yeah, and we are going to explore how that massive internal apparatus takes its domestic priorities and projects them outward onto the global stage.
Right, and specifically, we are going to pressure test its complex modern-day partnership with the Russian Federation.
To map out this architecture, we are pulling from a massive stack of foundational intelligence.
We really are. We are analyzing two incredibly thorough backgrounders from the Council on Foreign Relations.
The first one is titled The Chinese Communist Party, and the second is China and Russia, exploring ties between two authoritarian powers.
Yeah, and we are also diving deep into two strategic reports from the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
One explores what are the key strengths of the China-Russia relationship,
while the other zeroes in on what are the key weaknesses of the China-Russia relationship, which is a really fascinating read.
It really is. And to decode the specific language these state actors use, we have a glossary of foreign policy and international relations terms 2026.
Finally, we are navigating through several incredibly complex structural charts detailing China national and international state agencies, the State Council and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and party-state relations in a Leninist system.
Having all of these documents in one place allows us to look past the diplomatic press conferences and, see the actual wiring of a global superpower.
So as you listen today, keep this central puzzle in the back of your mind. How does a single political party with over 96 million members manage to govern, control, and propel a rising global superpower?
And how did the deep-seated historical grievances etched into that party's institutional DNA dictate its current no-limits friendship with Russia?
Because as we dig into the data, you are going to see that this friendship might be significantly more fragile and fraught with demographic tension than it appears on the evening news.
That tension is the ultimate destination of our discussion. But before we can even begin to understand how Beijing acts when it sits down at a negotiating table in Moscow or Geneva, we have to look under the hood at the domestic engine that drives every single decision.
Right, we have to understand the Chinese Communist Party itself.
Exactly.
Let's start at the very base of the structural charts we are looking at. The sources repeatedly use the term Leninist single-party structure.
Which is key to understand.
Right, because when you or I think of a political party, we think of an organization that campaigns for votes.
Yeah, they raise money, they run ads, they try to win an election.
Exactly. But a Leninist system is something entirely different. It is a parallel universe of governance. So what does this actually look like on the ground for an average citizen?
Well, if you visualize the structural charts, you are looking at a colossal, incredibly steep pyramid. And it begins right at the dirt level.
The grassroots.
Yeah, the absolute lowest tier of government in this structure involves village committees, which are run by local village leaders, and township governments, which are led by a township mayor.
Okay.
These are the grassroots figures handling local disputes, local enterprise, and everyday administration.
But the chart makes a crucial distinction here, right? The mayor isn't actually the one driving the car.
Never. At every single level of the state government, there is a parallel corresponding position held by an official from the Chinese Communist Party.
So it's always a pair.
Exactly. So at that grassroots level, you have the township mayor handling the administrative paperwork, but standing right beside them and technically above them is the township party secretary.
And as you move up the pyramid, this dual structure simply scales up.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
You move from the township to the county level, where you find a county mayor paired with a county party secretary.
Wow, okay.
Above them is the city or district level, with a city mayor and a city party secretary.
And then you hit the provincial level, which is massive.
Huge. You have a provincial governor, overseeing the economy and administration of tens of millions of people, but they ultimately answer to the provincial party secretary.
So the party is always supreme.
Always. The party structure wraps around the state structure like vines around a tree, dictating its growth and movement at every single juncture.
I am looking at the numbers for the national peak, and the narrowing of this pyramid is staggering.
It really is.
At the base of the national leadership, you have the National Party Congress. The Council on Foreign Relations backgrounder notes this comprises around 3,000 members representing the entire country, and they only meet every 5 years.
Right, but 3,000 people cannot execute granular day-to-day governance. I mean, a body that size is essentially designed to be a rubber stamp for broader ideological goals.
So they are not the ones actually pulling the levers every day.
No, not at all. So the National Party Congress selects a smaller group called the Central Committee, which is about 370 members.
Which is still a lot of people.
It is, but they act somewhat like a corporate board of directors, meeting annually in sessions known as plenums to dictate broad policy direction.
But even 370 people is too many to run a superpower in real time, so the funnel gets tighter.
Much tighter. The Central Committee selects the Politburo, which is 25 members. These are the elite power brokers.
The inner circle.
Yeah. But the absolute epicenter of power, the summit of the pyramid, is chosen through highly secretive, opaque negotiations among that group.
And who are they?
They form the Standing Committee of the Politburo.
7 people.
Just 7.
Out of a nation of over 1.4 billion, it comes down to a room of 7 men. And sitting at the head of that table is the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping.
Right, and under Xi Jinping, the entire dynamic of that pyramid has shifted.
How so?
Well, the Center for Strategic and International Studies reports detail how heavily he has consolidated control since taking power in 2012.
Because it didn't used to be this centralized, right?
No, not really. The party has moved aggressively away from the collective, consensus-based leadership style that defined the decades following the 1980s. He currently wields 3 supreme titles simultaneously, which is the ultimate key to his authority.
Let's break those hats down because they represent the total fusion of the state, the party, and the military.
First, he is the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, which gives him absolute control over the political apparatus.
Okay, so he controls the party vines.
Right. Second, he is the President of the People's Republic of China, which is his state title used for international diplomacy.
So that is the hat he wears when he meets with other world leaders.
Exactly. And third, crucially, he is the chairman of the Central Military Commission.
And that is the military control.
Yeah, but remember, the military does not serve the state. The People's Liberation Army serves the party, and he commands it directly.
Wow. There is a quote in the reading from the scholar Ian Johnson that just leaps off the page. He states simply, "Run the party and you run China."
It is the ultimate truth of the system.
But what the backgrounders make clear is that Xi didn't just inherit this total control, he engineered it through an unprecedented anti-corruption campaign.
A massive campaign.
The texts mention that this campaign investigated more than 4 million officials. 4 million.
It is an incomprehensible number.
And they use this incredibly evocative phrasing, saying he targeted both high-level tigers and lower-level flies.
The genius of targeting both the powerful tigers and the everyday bureaucratic flies is that it served a dual purpose.
What was the purpose for the general public?
For the general public, it was wildly popular. Average citizens were exhausted by petty corruption, bribery, and the flaunting of wealth by local officials. Seeing the flies swatted brought genuine public approval.
Oh, I'm sure. It feels like justice is finally being served at the local level. But the tigers were the real strategic targets, right?
Oh, absolutely. The tigers were potential political rivals within the Politburo and the military.
So it was a purge.
Essentially, yes. By utilizing the party's internal disciplinary commission, which operates entirely outside the standard legal system, he systematically dismantled competing factions.
Because if you can arrest anyone for corruption, and let's face it, corruption was everywhere, you can selectively eliminate your rivals.
Precisely. And when you remove that many individuals from power, you create an enormous vacuum. She filled those vacant roles with absolute loyalists.
Which culminated in the elimination of presidential term limits altogether, shattering a precedent that was meant to prevent the return of strongman indefinite rule.
He essentially rewrote the rules of succession.
But hold on, I need to push back on this architecture, because Former party insiders quoted in our sources raise a massive red flag.
Oh, the blind spot argument.
Yes, we are looking at a system that has systematically hunted down and removed anyone who might offer a dissenting opinion.
Right.
If you run a massive apparatus and the leadership crushes all forms of policy debate to ensure ideological purity, aren't you essentially flying blind?
It is a huge risk.
I mean, by eliminating all internal pushback, hasn't the leadership engineered its own vulnerability to catastrophic miscalculations?
That is the central anxiety humming beneath the surface of the entire system. You have to remember, the Chinese Communist Party survived the geopolitical earthquake of the late 20th century, specifically the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, because it possessed a technocratic capacity to adapt.
They saw what happened to the Soviets and pivoted.
Exactly. It looked at the Soviet collapse and realized that ideological rigidity leads to economic death. They instituted intra-party reform, allowed for internal debate, and embraced global markets to lift millions out of poverty.
They allowed the system to breathe a little bit.
But now, with power so intensely centralized around one individual and a standing committee of loyalists, the oxygen for internal debate is gone.
The mechanism for self-correction is severely diminished.
It is. If the leadership makes a fundamental miscalculation regarding real estate debt, pandemic response, or foreign policy, there is no longer a robust, protected faction within the party to pull the alarm cord.
Because everyone is just yes men now.
Exactly. Total unity provides immense, terrifying strength in executing a vision, but it creates a massive blind spot. When everyone is terrified of being investigated by the Anti-Corruption Commission, officials stop delivering bad news.
And bad news is exactly what you need to hear to run a country effectively.
Right.
So we have this massive, unchallengeable brain, the party. Now we need to look at how this brain actually moves its limbs. Let's transition to the state agencies.
The bureaucratic organs that have to execute these uncompromising directives both at home and on the global stage.
Right. If we consult the structural chart for the China national and international state agencies, we can map out the key figures managing the state apparatus.
That's quite a lineup.
We have Li Cheng serving as the state council premier, essentially managing the massive domestic economy. We have Wang Yi as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, acting as the chief diplomat. We have Admiral Dong Jun serving as the Minister of National Defense, and Chen Yixin operating as the Minister of State Security, handling the vast intelligence and secret police apparatus.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is particularly vital for our focus today.
Let's zoom in on them.
Looking at the breakdown, it appears as logical and structured as any Western State Department. It is divided into geographic departments, African affairs, Asian affairs, European Union affairs, and functional departments like international law, consular affairs, and arms control.
On paper, it looks perfectly normal. I mean, if you are a foreign diplomat, you know exactly which office to call.
You do, but the expert sources introduce a bureaucratic phenomenon that is honestly mind-bending. It completely shatters the illusion of a standard government.
The documents call it one institution bearing two names.
This is where the theoretical separation between the state and the party evaporates into thin air.
Completely.
The most prominent, glaring example provided in our stack of research is the agency responsible for handling relations with Taiwan.
Let's walk through this because it is wild.
On the state side, looking at a government directory, it is listed as the Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Council.
A standard government department dealing with a regional issue.
But simultaneously, by its very charter, it is the Taiwan Work Office of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee.
Wait, so it's the same office?
The exact same office. The document explicitly states, and this is crucial, with the same leadership and establishment, the institution uses different names according to the required professional needs. It reports to the Central Committee.
I want to make sure you, the listener, are fully grasping this because it sounds like a riddle. It is the exact same physical building, the exact same desks, the exact same computers, the exact same personnel.
Everything is the same.
But the officials sitting at those desks have two entirely different sets of business cards in their pockets. One card says they represent the state council, the government. The other card says they represent the Central Committee, the party.
And they simply choose which card to hand out based on who walks into the room.
The reading provides another striking example. The National Administration for the Protection of State Secrets.
All right, that is the state name. But it operates simultaneously as the Office of Secrets Protection Committee of the Central Committee. It reports directly to the General Office of the party.
It is a massive geopolitical ventriloquist act.
That is the perfect way to describe it.
The State Council, the official government agency, is the puppet moving its mouth at the podium. But the Chinese Communist Party is the ventriloquist standing right behind it, throwing the voice and controlling every single movement.
Absolutely.
But I have to ask, how effective is this bureaucratic camouflage in the real world? When seasoned diplomats from Europe, South America, or Africa sit down at a negotiating table with representatives from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the State Council, do they actually fall for the ventriloquist act?
Well, seasoned diplomats are not naive. They understand the Leninist structure. They know that the person across the table is ultimately implementing a directive from the Politburo.
So they know it's a front.
They do. However, the dual naming convention provides something incredibly valuable in international relations: plausible deniability.
For the foreign governments.
Exactly. Many foreign governments face intense domestic scrutiny from their own citizens or opposition parties regarding human rights or democratic principles. Engaging directly with the Communist Party apparatus is politically toxic.
Oh, I see. So it gives them political cover at home.
Right. By utilizing the State Council or Ministry moniker, Beijing allows those foreign governments to maintain the diplomatic fiction that they are simply engaging in standard state-to-state relations with the normal bureaucracy.
It smooths the friction of global commerce and diplomacy.
It is a convenient fiction for everyone involved.
We aren't signing a trade deal with a party. We are signing a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Commerce.
Exactly. But the danger for the foreign actor is forgetting the reality beneath the fiction.
Because the party's always in charge.
Always. Every concession negotiated, every treaty signed is advancing a grand strategic worldview engineered entirely by the party.
To decipher what that worldview actually is and to understand why they take such aggressive postures on certain issues, we need to equip you with the proper academic vocabulary.
The glossary is really helpful here.
Yeah, the Glossary of Foreign Policy and International Relations Terms 2026, provided in the sources, acts as a Rosetta Stone for their strategic thinking.
Let's begin with the baseline operating system of international relations: realpolitik.
Which sounds very intense.
It is. The glossary defines this as foreign policy based on practical, material concerns, specifically the balance of power among nation-states rather than ideology, ethics, or moral premises.
This feeds directly into the broader concept of realism, right?
Yes, realism essentially argues that the global arena is an anarchic jungle.
There is no global 911 to call if you are attacked.
Exactly. Therefore, states act purely out of self-interest, seeking military and economic power simply to survive the chaos.
The Chinese leadership deeply understands material power and acts as a classic realist state when building its military and securing supply chains.
They definitely do. However, the fascinating nuance in our sources is how they contrast realism with constructivism.
Okay, let's unpack constructivism because it flips realism on its head.
It really does. It suggests that international politics isn't just about who has the most tanks or the biggest economy. It argues that the anarchy of the global system is socially constructed through shared beliefs, norms, historical identities, and human interaction.
And because it is constructed, it can be fundamentally changed.
This is where Beijing's modern strategy truly operates.
How so?
Well, Chinese leadership frequently utilizes constructivist rhetoric and diplomacy. They are not merely reacting to the Western-dominated global system. They are actively attempting to reshape its fundamental norms.
So they want to change the rules of the game.
They want to construct a new reality where the definitions of human rights, governance, and international law are more aligned with our own authoritarian structure.
They don't just want to win the game. They are trying to rewrite the rule book while the game is being played.
That is a great way to put it. And a major chapter in that new rule book is the concept of multipolarity.
The glossary defines multipolarity as an international system characterized by the presence of several great powers with relatively similar military and economic strength.
They fundamentally reject the unipolar world order that existed after the Cold War, where the United States operated as the sole, unchallenged hegemon.
They want a board with multiple kings.
Exactly. But the most critical term in this entire glossary, the bedrock of their diplomatic posture, is absolute sovereignty.
This one is huge. The text defines this as the supreme and absolute power to govern an independent state within its territorial borders, including the paramount right to regulate its internal affairs completely free from any foreign interference.
That phrase, free from any foreign interference, is non-negotiable.
To understand the visceral, almost militant way they guard this concept, we have to connect it to another critical term: historical grievances.
Right. Historical grievances refers to how a nation's previous trauma, humiliation, or subjugation by foreign powers heavily dictates its current foreign policy.
And for the Chinese Communist Party, that trauma is very specific.
The century of humiliation stretching from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century is not some distant historical footnote. It is the central organizing trauma of their political identity.
What exactly happened during that period that left such a deep scar?
During this period, foreign imperial powers forced the Qing dynasty into unequal treaties, seizing territory, dictating trade, and subjugating the population.
So when Western nations issue statements today condemning actions in Hong Kong or scrutinizing policies in Xinjiang or sailing naval vessels near Taiwan, Beijing doesn't just see a diplomatic disagreement.
No, they view it through the lens of that historical trauma. They see foreign imperialists once again trying to dictate terms inside their borders.
The insistence on absolute sovereignty is their armor against a repeat of the century of humiliation.
That's exactly what it is.
I understand the historical trauma, I really do. But looking at their modern actions, there is a massive, glaring contradiction here.
Let's hear it.
On one hand, China fiercely champions globalization. The glossary defines globalization as the increasing integration of global interactions and the massive exchange of goods around the world. China's miraculous economic rise, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, was entirely dependent on deeply integrating into global supply chains and foreign markets.
They are the ultimate beneficiaries of an interconnected world.
Exactly. But on the other hand, they demand impenetrable, airtight, absolute sovereignty. It is a fundamental paradox.
It is a tough needle to thread.
It is like an employee demanding all the collaborative benefits of an open plan office. The free coffee, the shared resources, the networking, but insisting on building a soundproof, solid brick wall around their own desk, screaming if anyone even looks at their computer screen.
That is a hilarious image, but it's very accurate.
How long can a global superpower successfully exploit deep economic integration while maintaining an absolute militant refusal to allow the outside world to influence its domestic actions?
The friction generated by that paradox is the defining geopolitical conflict of our time.
It really is.
The official doctrine in Beijing argues that economic globalization and sovereign political isolation are entirely compatible.
But are they really?
The reality of the 21st century is that economics, technology, human rights, and data security are inherently fused. You cannot separate a microchip supply chain from national security.
You absolutely cannot.
As China's global footprint expands, its internal actions inevitably create massive external ripples. The West argues that a state cannot be deeply structurally embedded in the global economic order while simultaneously rejecting the normative rules and transparency of that order when it becomes inconvenient.
And this is why Beijing is using constructivist tactics to try and alter those global norms.
Right, to make the world safe for its specific brand of authoritarian capitalism.
And their profound desire to reshape those global rules, combined with their deep-seated historical grievances against the Western-dominated order, brings us to the most complex and consequential relationship on the map today.
Their partnership with the Russian Federation.
If we take all these abstract concepts, the Leninist need for internal control, the drive for a multipolar world, and the trauma of historical grievances and project them onto geography, we land squarely on the 2,600-mile border shared by China and Russia.
To understand the current no-limits partnership, we have to look at the historical scars along that border.
It hasn't always been a friendly border, has it?
Not at all. The source materials, specifically the backgrounders on Sino-Soviet relations, make it clear that this history is incredibly turbulent. We are talking about centuries of friction, starting back in the era of empires.
The historical territorial divisions are the foundation of their modern dynamic. The readings trace this back to 1689 with the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which established early, somewhat equal trade relations.
But the narrative darkens significantly in the mid-19th century.
Right in the middle of China's century of humiliation.
Exactly. While Western powers were encroaching from the sea, the Russian Empire was encroaching from the north.
And they took advantage of the situation.
They absolutely did. The Treaty of Agen in 1858 and the Treaty of Beijing in 1860 were devastating for the Qing dynasty.
These were classic unequal treaties.
Through these specific agreements, Russia annexed vast, resource-rich territories in what is now the Russian Far East. They literally redrew the map at the barrel of a gun, while China was weakened by internal rebellion and Western wars.
Fast forward into the 20th century, and the dynamic wildly fluctuated between ideological brotherhood and a near-total war.
It was a very volatile relationship.
Following the Communist Revolution in China, you had a period of Sino-Soviet alliance from 1950 to roughly 1960.
But that rapidly deteriorated into the Sino-Soviet split. There were two massive, proud communist powers competing for ideological supremacy over the global revolutionary movement.
And it wasn't just diplomatic bickering, right? They engaged in violent border skirmishes in 1969, notably around Zhenbo Island.
We're talking about two nuclear-armed powers actively shooting at each other over contested territory. The animosity was profound.
Which makes the modern trajectory of their relationship so strategically fascinating.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, they realized that lingering border disputes were a mutual vulnerability. The documents detail how they methodically resolved their territorial claims on paper.
Step by step.
In 1991, they signed a friendship treaty. A decade later, in 2001, they signed the Sino-Russian Good Neighborly Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation.
And this methodical warming culminated in a moment that fundamentally altered the current global landscape. On February 4th, 2022, literally weeks before Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin met in Beijing.
And they issued a massive, sweeping joint statement declaring that the friendship between their two states has no limits, and that there are no forbidden areas of cooperation.
The phrase "no limits" sent shockwaves through Western intelligence and diplomatic circles.
No, it was a massive wake-up call. To understand why they would make such a bold declaration, we have to examine the core strengths holding them together.
What does the Center for Strategic and International Studies report say about that?
It clearly outlines the mutual benefits. The primary overriding driver of this relationship is a profound, shared threat perception regarding the United States.
They both view American hegemony and the expansion of Western alliances, whether it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe or American security pacts in the Indo-Pacific, as a direct existential threat to their respective regimes.
The enemy of my enemy is my no-limits partner.
This shared grievance acts as a powerful strategic glue. We see this manifested not just in bilateral trade, but in their active collaboration to build alternative multilateral institutions.
They want to dilute Western power wherever they can.
The sources heavily emphasize their leadership in groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which focuses on Eurasian security and economics.
And perhaps even more critically, their work within the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa coalition.
The BRICS group.
Yes. The Council on Foreign Relations Backgrounder points out that this coalition has become a highly effective vehicle for garnering support and influence among developing nations in the Global South who feel marginalized by Western institutions like the International Monetary Fund.
One of the most potent ambitions of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa coalition is the push for de-dollarization.
This is huge. China and Russia recognize that the ultimate weapon of the West is not necessarily military, but financial.
Because the dominance of the United States dollar gives Washington immense power to enact crippling economic sanctions.
Exactly. By promoting trade in local currencies, like the Chinese yuan, Beijing and Moscow are actively trying to build a financial bunker to insulate themselves from Western economic coercion.
Beyond these global architectures, the partnership thrives because Moscow provides something Beijing desperately needs: absolute, unquestioning diplomatic cover for its core internal priorities.
The Center for Strategic and International Studies notes that Russia explicitly accepts and legitimizes China's authoritarian political system. When Western nations issue sanctions over human rights, Moscow applauds Beijing's internal security measures.
This support extends to the most sensitive territorial tripwires.
Right. Russia fully endorses Beijing's One China principle, vocally opposing any form of Taiwanese independence. They provide diplomatic backing for China's sweeping territorial claims in the East and South China Seas.
And in exchange, China largely abstains from criticizing Russian military interventions, creating a transactional ecosystem of mutual authoritarian protection.
Very reciprocal.
But I cannot ignore a massive historical irony here.
What's that?
We spent significant time discussing how the Chinese Communist Party utilizes historical grievances, specifically the fury over the 19th century unequal treaties, as the core pillar of its modern nationalism. They demand the return of historical territories.
Right.
Yet the research explicitly notes that the treaties of Agun and Beijing, where Russia annexed a massive chunk of the continent, are the only two unequal treaties forced upon the Qing dynasty that modern China has not officially overturned or challenged.
The cognitive dissonance is really striking. The border dispute is officially settled by modern treaties, but the historical memory of that stolen land remains deeply embedded in the Chinese national consciousness.
This brings me to a critical point of skepticism. If these two nations share a massive, historically contested border, a legacy of ideological betrayal, and a deep-seated nationalism that resents foreign annexation, is this no-limits partnership a genuine alliance or just a temporary marriage of convenience?
The sources point out that despite the grand rhetoric, they are not formal treaty allies.
Why haven't they signed an actual mutual defense pact, like the one the United States has with its European partners or even the one China has with North Korea?
Well, the absence of a mutual defense pact is not an oversight. It is a calculated feature of their relationship. A formal military alliance requires a rigid, legally binding commitment to unconditional military assistance if the other party is attacked.
And they don't want to be tied down like that.
The reading from the strategic analysts specifically highlights that a formal alliance is off the table because both sides, but Beijing in particular, demand absolute strategic flexibility.
They want the terrifying optic of a united front to intimidate the West without the legal obligation of being dragged into a devastating war by an unpredictable partner.
Precisely. They share a profound mutual interest in dismantling Western power. But they also possess deeply conflicting regional interests.
Let's talk about those conflicting interests. When you look past the diplomatic summits and examine the reality on the ground, the economic data, the demographics, the military actions, you begin to see massive structural cracks in the foundation of this no-limits friendship.
Let's transition into those cracks because the Center for Strategic and International Studies report on the weaknesses of the relationship paints a picture of dangerous asymmetry and deep, lingering mistrust.
The most glaring weakness is the widening economic power gap.
It is massive. While bilateral trade has skyrocketed, particularly as Russia pivots away from Europe due to sanctions, the relationship is fundamentally imbalanced.
Russia is rapidly becoming the junior partner. Moscow is heavily dependent on China as a lifeline for its energy exports and as a source for critical technologies.
And China has a multitude of global trading partners. Russia's options are severely constrained.
The strategic reports note that in the long term, this widening inequality is a massive source of anxiety for Moscow. A proud, historically imperial power like Russia does not want to realize it, has been reduced to a mere resource appendage, a glorified gas station for the Chinese industrial machine.
And this imbalance isn't just an abstract economic concept. It is playing out physically, generating profound demographic tension along the border.
The numbers in the sources regarding the Russian Far East are legitimately alarming. We have a quote from an ABC News analysis that is incredibly provocative.
What did it say?
The official in charge of controlling the Russian-Chinese border publicly stated that the real invasion of Russia isn't happening with tanks, but with suitcases.
Now, he was referring to illegal immigration and the massive demographic disparity between the two sides of the border. He claimed that 1.5 million Chinese citizens had illegally entered the Russian Far East over just an 18-month period.
Wait, 1.5 million undocumented crossings into the sovereign territory of a deeply nationalistic, heavily armed neighbor. How does Moscow not perceive that as a slow-motion demographic annexation?
Oh, they absolutely perceive the threat, which is what makes the dynamic so volatile.
Yeah.
The analysis builds on this, adding that tensions in Siberia and the Far East are boiling over.
Paint us a picture of the region.
You have a massive, resource-rich region in Russia with a shrinking population of perhaps 6 or 7 million people. Right across the river, you have hundreds of millions of resource-hungry Chinese citizens.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. Chinese state-backed enterprises and private citizens are pouring billions of dollars of investment into the Russian Far East. They're building infrastructure, leasing massive tracts of agricultural land, and logging the forests.
This Chinese capital is essentially keeping the local Russian economy afloat.
It is, but it is creating intense localized resentment among the Russian population. They fear they are being economically and demographically consumed by a foreign power, while their leaders in Moscow look the other way.
The leaders in Moscow declare eternal friendship, while the citizens on the border feel like they are being bought out from under their own feet.
It is a deeply unstable situation.
But the demographic tension is a slow burn. The biggest, most immediate crack in the foundation, the one threatening to shatter the relationship entirely, is Russia's recent military aggression.
Yes, the invasion of Ukraine.
The sources are definitive that Russia's invasion of Ukraine runs entirely counter to the core foundational principles of Chinese foreign policy.
This is the pivotal divergence in their grand strategies. The Chinese Communist Party has meticulously crafted a narrative for the global South.
And what is that narrative?
They characterize China as a peaceful, stabilizing power focused on economic development, mutually beneficial trade, and above all else, the strict observance of territorial integrity and absolute non-interference in the affairs of sovereign states.
They want to quietly, methodically rewire the international system through loans, infrastructure projects, and trade dependencies.
But their closest strategic partner, Vladimir Putin, operates under a completely different paradigm.
A much more violent paradigm.
The analysts categorize Russia under Putin as a revolutionary state. He is actively using violent, kinetic military force to invade sovereign neighbors, redraw borders with tanks, and overtly shatter the existing international order through chaos.
This puts the leadership in Beijing in an incredibly awkward, frankly dangerous political position. Their official diplomatic doctrine literally states they never invade or bully other countries, yet they have publicly chained themselves to a state actively bombing a neighbor.
Furthermore, the blowback from this war has severely diminished Russia's strategic utility.
How so?
The war has depleted the Russian military, isolated its economy, and galvanized the very Western alliances like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that China and Russia were hoping to fracture.
So it completely backfired.
Beijing is now forced into a high-wire balancing act. They must quietly support Moscow just enough to prevent the collapse of their authoritarian partner and maintain a united front against Washington, but they must distance themselves enough to avoid being hit by devastating secondary sanctions from the West that would cripple the Chinese economy.
I keep thinking about this dynamic like a high-stakes group project in a master's program.
Go on.
You are China. You are the methodical, hyper-organized student trying to secure dominance through quiet, meticulous, decades-long planning. You have your spreadsheets, your supply chain logistics, your economic forecasts.
Right.
But your project partner, Russia, has decided the best way to challenge the presser is to stand on the table and throw chairs across the library.
That is a brilliant analogy. It completely blows up the methodical timeline. Chaos is bad for global supply chains, and the Chinese economy relies on the stability of those supply chains.
So, if you are sitting in the Politburo looking at the data, the question has to be asked. At what point does the cost of Russia's unpredictable, chaotic aggression outweigh the geopolitical benefit of having a partner to distract the United States?
That is the trillion-dollar question.
If Russia becomes too isolated, too economically depleted, and its actions threaten the stability of global markets, when does the guy throwing chairs get kicked out of the group? When does Russia transition from being a strategic asset to becoming a fatal liability to the Chinese Communist Party's ultimate goal of national rejuvenation?
Well, that calculus is constantly being evaluated at the highest levels of the party.
What do the experts think?
The Center for Strategic and International Studies report concludes that, for the moment, leaders in Beijing have assessed that the benefits of keeping Russia close, securing their northern border, acquiring cheap energy, and forcing the United States to fight a two-front diplomatic war still outweigh the substantial costs.
But that math is not permanent.
No, it isn't. If the economic asymmetry deepens to the point where Moscow feels existentially threatened by Beijing, or if Russia takes an action that triggers a global economic crisis, threatening the Chinese Communist Party's domestic grip on power, the partnership will fracture.
The shared desire to challenge the West is powerful, but the Chinese Communist Party's ultimate, unshakable loyalty is strictly to its own survival.
Exactly.
Let's pull all of this together and synthesize the massive landscape we have traversed today. We started our deep dive at the very dirt-level base of the Leninist pyramid, looking at how grassroots village committees are managed by local party secretaries.
We climbed that steep structure all the way up to the absolute centralized peak of the Chinese Communist Party, examining how Xi Jinping utilized an anti-corruption campaign against tigers and flies to engineer unchallengeable command.
We then decoded how that internal party brain utilizes the state agencies, the state council, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a ventriloquist puppet.
We explored how they leverage academic frameworks like constructivism, the demand for absolute sovereignty, and the deep trauma of historical grievances to actively attempt to rewrite the rules of the global order.
And finally, we map those exact same domestic drivers onto the 2,600-mile border with Russia. We saw how a shared hatred of Western hegemony creates a powerful no-limits alignment, while simultaneously generating dangerous friction, massive economic asymmetry, and profound ideological contradictions beneath the diplomatic rhetoric.
If there's one core takeaway for you to carry forward, it is this analytical framework.
The next time you see a news alert about a joint naval drill between Beijing and Moscow, or a new economic directive regarding the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa coalition coming out of the State Council, you are no longer just looking at the surface-level event.
You now possess the analytical tools to see the shadow structure. You can see the party machinery pulling the levers.
You can see the ventriloquist, not just the puppet. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to pressure test everything we've discussed.
Let's hear it.
We established that the Chinese Communist Party's paramount goal is internal stability, absolute control, and the restoration of its historical greatness without any foreign interference.
Right.
But how will a system built on methodical, total control eventually reconcile its survival with the chaotic, disruptive, revolutionary actions of its closest strategic partner?
Will the ultimate test of this fragile no-limits partnership happen not in a high-profile standoff in Eastern Europe or the Taiwan Strait, but quietly, inevitably, as massive demographic and economic pressures finally rupture along the icy, historically contested borders of the Russian Far East?
Keep digging deeper on that one.
Thank you for navigating these murky waters with us.
Until next time.